Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving headfirst into a theory that literally takes a sledgehammer to the mainstream narrative of the Great Sphinx. And look, according to the source material we're looking at today, this isn't based on ancient myths or folklore. No, we are talking about hard physics. We're actually going to treat the Giza Plateau like an active forensic crime scene to really unpack this highly controversial perspective. So let's just jump right into the central mystery here. Why on earth did the gatekeepers of mainstream archaeology quietly pour modern industrial-grade concrete straight into the top of the Sphinx's head? Now, officially, they called it a historical preservation effort. Right. But when we actually audit the physics of this monument through the lens of our sources, a totally startling theory emerges. This wasn't historical preservation at all. It was a deliberate act of physical sabotage. You see, there's this massive, stark contrast between the orthodox explanations and the forensic theory we're exploring. Mainstream Egyptologists will tell you that any hole in the Sphinx's head was just, hacked out by clumsy tomb robbers, or maybe it was used to anchor some ornate stone crown. But the physical reality, at least according to the researchers behind this theory, it was a perfectly bored, completely uniform, 5-foot-deep, circular shaft plunging straight down into solid limestone bedrock. And the main argument here is simple. You absolutely cannot achieve a perfect, uniform bore like that using primitive tools. No way. Okay, so this brings us back to the year 1926. This was when a French engineer named Emil Baraize was commissioned to clear away thousands of tons of sand that had literally buried the Sphinx right up to its neck. And during this massive, basically unmonitored excavation, Baraize meticulously documented, mapped, and photographed this exact 5-foot cranial shaft. The photographic proof of this anomaly has been sitting there for nearly a century. But proponents of this theory keep asking the same question. Why does it seem to be systematically erased from modern textbooks and all the tourist literature? Well, to understand why this shaft is so absolutely crucial, the sources point straight to physics. Specifically, something called a Helmholtz Acoustic Tuning Port. Now, in physical acoustics, a Helmholtz Resonator basically works by trapping and amplifying a very specific frequency of sound inside a cavity. It's kind of like blowing air across the top of an empty glass bottle to create a tone, right? We've all done that. Well, the source material argues that the Sphinx wasn't just some static, decorative statue. It was actually the surface-level calibration dial, literally the physical interface for a massive solid-state acoustic machine operating deep underground. And here is the actual Helmholtz resonance equation. Now, don't let the math intimidate you here, because the underlying logic is just fascinating. The resonant frequency is dictated by a few things: the speed of sound, the volume of the underlying cavity, and crucially, the cross-sectional area and length of the tuning port itself. The theory claims that by physically altering the column of air inside that 5-foot cranial shaft, maybe by, adjusting a fluid level or inserting stone plugs, ancient operators could change those exact variables. Why? To mathematically tune the massive subterranean chambers down below to a very specific, exact baseline frequency. And what was that target frequency? 110 hertz. According to the source texts, this ancient pre-Diluvian machine was continuously calibrating its entire underground network to ring at this exact resonant baseline. Every single part of it was allegedly engineered specifically to amplify a 110 hertz standing wave. But before we get into why that specific frequency is such a game changer, we kind of have to address the elephant in the room. How do the sources claim they actually built this thing? So, mainstream orthodoxy loves to suggest that Bronze Age peasants just carved these massive structures out with primitive copper chisels. But let's just look at the Mohs hardness scale for a second. As1 red granite, which makes up a ton of the internal architecture over at Giza, is heavily composed of quartz crystal, and quartz has a hardness of 7. Copper, on the other hand, has a hardness of 3. The source material argues pretty forcefully that it is literally a metallurgical impossibility to cut a 7 with a 3. If you try it, you're going to instantly destroy your tool. It just doesn't work. Which begs the question, so how did they bore that perfect cranial shaft and slice through that granite? Well, the theory suggests these ancient builders might have used high-frequency acoustic cavitation. And here's where it gets really crazy. NASA and the Jet Propulsion Lab actually reverse-engineered this exact physical process and patented it back in the year 2000. They call it ultrasonic machining. Basically, by vibrating a blunt tool at just extreme frequencies inside an abrasive slurry, the intense acoustic resonance actually physically shatters the atomic lattice of the stone right at the microscopic level. The researchers argue that is exactly how you perfectly bore into solid limestone bedrock. Now, according to the timeline laid out in this research, modern intelligence agencies have actually been tracking this whole thing for decades. Way back in 1932, the mystic Edgar Cayce prophesied there was a chamber hidden beneath the Sphinx's right paw. Then, in 1952, right under the fog of the Egyptian Revolution, the texts claim that embedded CIA operatives bypassed local authorities and covertly verified this. They supposedly generated a classified photographic catalog referencing a temple beneath the Sphinx. The theory states that the intelligence apparatus just sat on this secret for decades. That is, until some civilian scientists accidentally stumbled upon it in 1997. That brings us to 1997. A geophysicist named Thomas Dobecki didn't just take a wild guess that there was a room down there. No, he used the hard physics of seismic refraction, which is completely governed by Snell's law. If you're not familiar, this absolute physical law calculates exactly how acoustic waves bend and change their velocity when they cross between geological layers of different densities. So Dobecki went out there and literally fired acoustic pulses directly into the bedrock all around the Sphinx.
And wow, you have to see what the data actually showed. Solid Giza limestone carries these acoustic seismic waves at incredibly high velocities. We're talking between 3,000 and 6,000 meters per second. But if those waves happen to hit an air-filled or waterlogged subterranean void, the acoustic impedance drastically shifts. Air only transmits sound at about 343 meters per second. And guess what? Dobecki's seismographers recorded a sudden, massive, exponential drop in wave velocity right directly beneath the Sphinx's right front paw.
Now, the mathematical output of those seismic waves didn't just map out some random natural sinkhole or a collapsed cave. No, it mapped what researchers argue is a highly engineered, completely artificial chamber. It measured exactly 25 feet wide by 40 feet long. And here's the kicker for anyone challenging the orthodox narrative. It had mathematically perfect 90-degree internal angles. Think about it. Geology just does not create perfect rectangles in nature. Only advanced engineering does that. Proponents of this theory firmly believe Dobecki had actually found the exact resonant cavity that cranial shaft was originally built to tune. So this whole thing raises a pretty profound question. Why the immediate panic from the authorities? Why would an intelligence apparatus be willing to expend massive resources just to suppress a seemingly empty stone room buried under the sand? Well, according to the theory, to answer that, we have to pivot away from the physical architecture for a second and look at the terrifying neurobiological motive for keeping this grid hidden from us. The researchers we're examining here point straight back to that 110 hertz frequency. In 2008, Dr. Ian Cook and a whole team of neuroscientists over at UCLA actually conducted peer-reviewed EEG and MRI studies on this. And they proved something wild. When a human is exposed to a 110 hertz standing wave, it literally acts like a biological override switch. The frequency mathematically suppresses the left temporal lobe, which is our analytical, fear-based processing center. And at the same time, it hyperactivates the prefrontal cortex. It basically forces the human brain right into a state of heightened, highly coherent consciousness. So according to the deep forensic analysis we are covering today, the gatekeepers were absolutely terrified. The theory is that these ancient underground temples were essentially engineered as massive, solid-state resonance engines, built specifically to elevate human frequency. The idea is that activating this massive guardian grid at 110 hertz would completely shatter what the sources describe as a localized frequency quarantine. Basically, they're saying it would snap humanity out of a low-frequency survival state of fear that currently limits all of us. And the moment Dobecki's civilian seismic data mathematically proved that chamber existed, the sources claim authorities initiated this frantic, multi-step suppression protocol. Step 1, the Egyptian Antiquities Ministry immediately swooped in and revoked the team's permits. Done. Step 2, they effectively militarized the site, permanently shutting down any public excavation. And step 3, well, they executed what proponents call a full-on physical sabotage operation, just to ensure this machine could literally never be turned back on again. Under the guise of a massive historical restoration project back in the 1990s, researchers point out that the authorities went straight to Emil Baraize's 1926 discovery. They literally poured modern industrial-grade Portland cement directly down that 5-foot cranial shaft, filling the whole thing completely flush with the top of the Sphinx's head. Now, remember that Helmholtz equation we looked at earlier? By filling that exact geometric void with dense concrete, they permanently and mathematically destroyed the tuning port. They fundamentally altered both its cross-sectional area and its effective length. And this brings us right to the ultimate gritty conclusion of this entire theory. They argue with a lot of conviction that this was not about fixing a crack in an old statue. It was intentional sabotage.
In this view, the authorities deliberately cemented a pre-Diluvian acoustic tuning dial completely shut. The claim here is that we basically caught the gatekeepers red-handed, permanently breaking the math of the Helmholtz Resonator just to detune this massive subterranean grid. Which leaves us all with one final, incredibly provocative thought to chew on today. Mainstream archaeology insists the Sphinx is nothing more than a solid block of stone, carved just to represent some dead pharaoh's ego. But honestly, if it's truly just a primitive, solid statue with zero technological function whatsoever, then what exactly were they so terrified of us turning on? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking the hard questions, and guys, never stop looking at the math.